Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Häxan, which means the witch, or Häxan Witchcraft Through the Ages, as the film was later known. Now, Häxan is a Swedish-Danish silent film which came out in 1922, and the film was written and directed by and starring Benjamin Christensen. Now, the film is an interesting mix between a documentary, and this was actually one of the first documentary films ever made, and sort of a docudrama using reenacted footage, again, one of the first of its kind, and a horror film. Now, at the same year as this, there was a film from Robert Flaherty called Nanook of the North, which is often called the first documentary film. However, the credibility of that documentary has very much been called into question because apparently Robert Flaherty did stage a lot of that. Now, Christensen based a lot of this, at least in part, on a book written in the 15th century called The Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of the Witches, and it was written by a German monk named Heinrich Kramer. Now, Kramer would later put the name of another monk on the book to give it more credibility, but most historians believe it was just written by the one man. The Malleus was essentially a manual for witch hunters to deal with witches, and the book is now pretty infamous for its intense misogyny, and also the book played a pretty big role in the witch trials in Europe. Although it should be noted that a lot of members of the elite at the time actually rejected the book, but the book was unfortunately accepted in a lot of places as well. One thing that's interesting to note is one of the villains of the film is named Father Heinrich, which is probably a reference to the writer of the Malleus. Now, the film was banned or heavily censored in many countries for its nudity and its scenes of torture and violence and its negative depiction of the church. Now, the main point of Häxan is it's meant to tie modern psychology, and keep in mind, the film came out in 1922, so back then it would have been modern, but it is very dated by today's standards, but it's meant to tie modern psychology in with witchcraft. And the film is kind of suggesting that what if a lot of these people who are accused of being witches back during the Middle Ages, and who might have actually thought they were witches, were actually the victims of hysteria? And also how ignorance of mental illness led to the persecution of a lot of these so-called witches. Now, this was originally intended to be the first of a trilogy. Christensen had planned to do 2 sequels to this, The Saint and The Spirits, but unfortunately those 2 sequels never happened. Now, while the film is meant to be factual, there are a lot of segments of this film dealing with fictional characters, and to illustrate what people believed in during the Middle Ages, there are a lot of fantasy sequences in this film dealing with witches and demons and the devil, and Benjamin Christensen plays Satan in the film. Now, I do think the movie has some problems as a documentary, but I'll talk about that more later on in this video, but as a piece of film history, this is actually a really important film in my opinion, and if you're at all interested in film and film history, you have to see this movie. And this is a fantastic film. It's one of my favorite silent films, and the movie is beautifully made and beautifully shot. And this was a really unique film for the time. Like, at the time, you really didn't see too many films like this, and actually, I would almost argue that this is still a really unique film. It's one of the few documentary films I can think of that also works as a horror film, because a lot of the film is very much fictionalized, which is why I would almost consider this more of a docudrama rather than a straight documentary. Like, it's basically a docudrama and a horror film. I remember I first saw this film actually on IFC back in like 2008, and IFC used to show some really interesting films. I mean, they might still, but frankly I stopped watching that channel once they started showing commercials during the movies. But before I stopped watching IFC, I actually discovered some really cool shit on that channel, this being among some of the really cool shit I found on that channel. Now, the film is broken up into 7 chapters. The first chapter is a slideshow lecture really talking about the history of man's belief in demons. It also illustrates how people back in the Middle Ages saw the universe given the very limited amount of scientific knowledge at the time. The second chapter is a collection of vignettes that sort of illustrate what people believed in during this time period. Among these vignettes is a rather comical one about a woman going to a witch to get a love potion so a pious monk would fall in love with her, and she has a daydream where this monk is like chasing her through a field and stuff. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 all tell one story, and this is where the movie goes from being a documentary to more of a traditional film. This section of the movie is really a drama about the horrors of the witch hunts and the abuse of power that happened during that time period. Basically, the plot of this section of the movie is an old woman is accused of witchcraft after a man gets sick, and people believe that this man was bewitched, and the man's wife points the finger at this old woman. And while she's being tortured, to get out of the torture, she comes up with these elaborate stories about her giving birth to the children of Satan, and her going to like a witch's sabbath where her and other witches would copulate with demons. And she starts naming names, and this snowballs to other people getting accused of being witches. And ultimately, the story leads to the wife of the man who originally got sick and pointed the finger at this old woman. It leads to her being accused of being a witch. Basically, in the movie, there's a monk who really starts to develop feelings for her, and he starts having impure thoughts about her, and this leads to the other monks essentially pressuring him into accusing her of being a witch. And you feel so bad for this woman by the end of the story, even though it's easy to hate her because she was the one who originally pointed the finger at the old woman, but you kind of get it given her mindset at the time, and also given the mindset of society at the time, and what they do to her at the end, you can't help but to feel sorry for her. And what these inquisitors do to get her to quote-unquote confess really is disgusting. That's why I said I really do think this section of the movie is also about the abuse of power that these witch hunters exerted. Now, I'm gonna get somewhat philosophical here, but in my opinion, if God and the devil do exist, I think something like the witch hunts would be exactly the kind of thing that God would be against and the devil would be all for. So in my opinion, these supposed men of God who were burning people at the stake for being witches, in my opinion, they were the true demons. They were the ones who were truly doing the devil's work. Now, while the monks are the villains of the movie, there is one sympathetic monk who you could tell feels tremendous guilt about what they're doing to these people. Chapter 6 is another series of vignettes, including one really hilarious one about Satan causing these nuns to go crazy. This vignette also has probably one of the funniest things I've ever seen. A nun refuses Satan's temptation, and then Satan just clocks her over the head with a club. In the 7th chapter of the movie, it flashes forward to modern day, and keep in mind, this movie came out in 1922, so back then it would have been modern day. And this section, to be honest, I think is the weakest point of the movie. I understand that it's sort of the main thesis of the film, that a lot of these women who were accused of witchcraft and might have actually believed they were witches back during the Middle Ages might have actually have been mentally ill. It also shows that a lot of these supernatural things that we saw in the film were probably just in the characters' heads. The issue is, in the middle section of the movie, not all the women you saw accused, I think, were necessarily mentally ill. Some of them were just confessing to get out of torture. And the diagnosis is hysteria, and it only shows women with hysteria. That's why I said earlier in this video that I thought the psychology in the film was very dated dated by today's standards. Now, I don't think there was any intentional misogyny on Christensen's part because you gotta realize this was 1922. This movie is just a few years shy of being 100 years old. But looking at it from a 21st century perspective, it really does almost come off as Christensen saying, "Look how fragile women are." So I can really see the final section of the movie rubbing some modern feminists the wrong way, but at the same time though, you gotta realize, the movie's 97 years old. There's also a little vignette in Chapter 7 about a kleptomaniac, but it really has no parallel with anything that we saw before. Again, I really do think Chapter 7 is the weakest point of the movie, even though it is, in theory, the main point of the film. Another issue this has as a documentary is there are some factual inaccuracies, like at one point in the movie it says that 8 million people were killed during the witch hunts, and apparently that number is a gross over-exaggeration. The actual number is more in like the 40,000 range, but it's nowhere near that number. So as I said, the movie does have some issues as a documentary, but as a film I think it's excellent, despite the final chapter being the weakest point in my opinion. And there are actually some really cool visuals in this film, and the fantasy sequences are really well done. And there's some really good stop-motion effects in this movie. Like, there's one point where these coins are making all these weird shapes on a floor. There's also a really cool claymation effect that I actually think still kind of holds up, where you see a little demon come out of a door. This is also one of the first films to utilize close-ups, which was actually pretty revolutionary for the time, and was also kind of offensive to some viewers. Now, I gotta point out that you could really tell that Christensen had a lot of fun playing Lucifer in this movie. Like, he's so over the top, but in a good way. Now, in 1968, there was a re-edited version of this movie, simply called Witchcraft Through the Ages, which was narrated by William S. Burroughs, who wrote books like Naked Lunch and Junkie. Now, this DVD from Criterion has the William S. Burroughs version on it, but to be honest, I didn't really care for the 1968 cut of the movie. I thought it was a little hammy, honestly, and the jazz score that they used for it really didn't work for the movie, in my opinion. Now, this movie would actually make a really good double feature with a 1925 silent film called Makis in Hell. Like, the way the demons are shot in both movies, and the way the demons look is very similar. But they are very different films. Like, Häxan is meant to be a documentary, and Makis in Hell is a straight fantasy film. This movie would also make a great double feature with something like Witchfinder General, the Michael Reeves movie with Vincent Price. That movie is also very much about the true horrors of the witch hunts, which were a very dark chapter in human history, I think. Like, the witch hunts, I really do think should be ranked alongside the Holocaust as one of the worst crimes against humanity ever committed. The big difference is the witch hunts happened over a period of centuries. You know what? Have a marathon of this, Witchfinder General, and the 1996 adaptation of Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Now that would be a good movie marathon. You might need to take some antidepressants when you're done, but it would still be an interesting movie marathon, I think. Now, apparently this film's use of close-ups was actually a direct influence on Carl Dreyer's film, The Passion of Joan of Arc. Also, I believe scenes from this movie were used in the 1934 film Maniac. Now, supposedly, and I heard this on IMDb, so take that with a grain of salt, but apparently the devil in the Ridley Scott film Legend, who was played by Tim Curry in that movie, apparently the look for the devil was directly influenced by Christensen's version of the devil. Also, Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, who made the Blair Witch Project, they named their production company Häxan Films as a direct reference to this movie. You could even see the influence of this in something like the Robert Eggers film The Witch. But yeah, that was my review on Häxan, Witchcraft Through the Ages, and bye.